Hey everyone, welcome to another Tea Time tutorial. My name is Brian Robinson with CodeContemporary.com. Today we're going to be talking about more Eleventy static site generator content. We're going to be talking about utilizing data files in your static site. So we're going to start with just some static data, and then we're going to move into, hopefully if there's time, ingesting some of that data from an API. A couple notes, I've got some links down in the description. One is to the Eleventy docs talking about data. It covers a lot more than I'm going to talk about today. One is to a blog post that I just published yesterday that's going to cover the dynamic portion of today. So if you're interested in getting some code snippets, you can go there and pick up the things that I'm going to talk about today. And then my Code Contemporary site, which houses all my courses, is an Eleventy static site. So be sure to go on over there, and also you can view the code on my GitHub account as well if you want to find out how I'm doing kind of some small stuff with Eleventy. So if you were here last week, we talked about the basics of Eleventy static site creation. So we installed the Eleventy module. We went ahead and set up some configuration in the .eleventy folder. And we can actually go ahead and take a look at a little bit of that over here. This is not exactly where we were last week, but it is pretty close. I went ahead and just used that as my template going forward. So you can see in my file tree over here, I've got a dist folder, which is where Eleventy is publishing my files. I've got my node modules. I've got a posts directory, and this is where blog posts are going. I've got my templates directory where I've got a couple includes and two templates, a base template and a post template. And then I have my Eleventy configuration file. The main things that we're doing in here as a review from last week is we added a collection to house our blog posts, and we did this return collection get filtered by glob with that string for matching all of our posts inside of our post directory. And then we're returning some simple configuration values, where our input is, which is the root, where the distribution goes, the dist folder, where our includes are, that's our templates folder, and then what template formats we want to accept, HTML, Markdown, and then CSS is just how you can have a pass-through CSS happen. And then our HTML template engine is Liquid, because that's my preference, although they support 5 or 6 right out of the box. And then our Markdown template engine is also Liquid. That's just my preference. They support Nunjucks, they support Pug, they support a whole bunch of different stuff. And then we also have an index.html, which is the home page. And all of this generates over in here. And so here is the HTML source. And you can see I have our first blog post here, just links over to the blog post Markdown and back home. And all of this is being served by the command Eleventy -- serve. In most of my production environments, I run this via either gulp or an NPM script, so I would run that instead. But Eleventy comes out of the box with a browser sync install, so it is good to go. So I'm going to take a pause real fast and make sure that there aren't any additional questions from last week. You can put them over in the chat, and it'll actually display on the template on my stream. And then I'm going to take a sip of my tea, which just like last week is Gypsy Cold Care, because I still can't quite kick what is going on in my chest and throat. Okay, there's a delay, so if there are questions, I will definitely be sure to pick them up as we go. But we're going to go ahead and dive into talking about data. Now, one of the things that I really enjoy about Eleventy, and we can go over to the docs and kind of see this, is the flexibility that they give you with your data. It's either going to be a JSON file or a JS file. But if we go over this using data section on the documentation, again, a link is in the description if you want to look at it yourself. You can actually specify this in a lot of different ways. We talked last week a little bit about how in our Markdown files, we can specify what's called front matter. And that's just this little block up here that is separated by 3 dashes. You can put variables up here, and those are actually translated into your posts as variables in the template. That's great, and that's great for a page-specific piece of content. But if you want something globally, or even from a section point of view, you want to separate that out into a data file. So in this case, we're going to do it in one of two ways. I'm going to show you a couple ways of doing that. The first we're going to talk about is global data files. And this is where we got kind of hung up last week, but what we're going to do is we're going to create an underscore data directory in our root, in our site root, right? So if you actually specified your site files for a different directory in that Eleventy configuration file, that would be where you want to put your data. So in this case, I'm just going to specify a new file, and we're going to call this settings.json. And this is actually something that I'm playing with more and more, is abstracting out some global settings for my site into a settings data file. So all I'm going to do is specify standard JSON, and I'm going to go ahead and give our site a site name. So I'm just going to have a site name property on this JSON object, and it's going to be, this is our site name. Save that in, and now in theory I can come into our header, right, and right where we've got our site title in our HTML, I can specify the name of my file. So this was the settings file, so that's kind of the root of our data object, and then any variable on that JSON object. So this is site name. I save that in. We don't have any errors in console. Excellent news. And we will turn on do not disturb mode. And now when we refresh the site, you can see here there's a variable here in our settings.json. This is our site name, is the variable, and we have in our title block in the tab, this is our site name. So this gives us global access to any variable in that data file, which means that we can access it in our header, we can access it in the footer. If we want to put a copyright down there, we can put it anywhere we need to. So that is a very useful thing to do. We're going to go ahead and put that in our head as maybe instead of home, we'll have the site name appear here. So we'll go here and we'll say this is settings.site name. And this is going to be dependent on how the template language that you choose for your Eleventy site wants its variable set up. Again, I like Jekyll. It's the way that my mind works the best. So we'll save that in, and now our home link is this is our site name. And if I go over to our post, that still persists over there. Coding Path says, puts me in the mind of Flask templates and Jinja. So yeah, that's one of the main reasons, honestly, that I use Liquid, right? 8-9 years ago now, I worked for a company that used Django as our main framework, and the Jinja 2 syntax is still, I heart it so hard. And then my last company, when we finally implemented a templating engine, we chose Twig in PHP specifically because it had that same syntax, it had the same extensions. Liquid's not quite as powerful as Twig or as Jinja. It doesn't have those template extensions. I actually need to start working on getting myself into Nunjux. Nunjux is a little bit more along those lines. It's all kind of in that same path, though. I definitely, yeah, I heart Jinja, so I get you on that. All right, so that's great for global data, and I'm going to show in a minute how we can hopefully pull in some Meetup API data in that as well. But for now, I want to show you there's another way of giving your templates data. So that's the global data files. There's also this idea of, where is it, template and directory data files. So if we look here, this is kind of a lot of data right in kind of a 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of setup. But each of our directories and subdirectories and subdirectories can take some form of data file as well. So that may not make sense when you think like a post, right, might not want some sort of global section data, but what can be very helpful on that is that in Eleventy, we have to specify our layout on every single markdown file. So that gets really repetitive. We have to say that over and over and over again. We can abstract this out into a JSON file of its own inside of our posts directory. So I'm going to come into the post directory, and I'm going to specify a new file, and we're going to call it posts. I'm not focused in there. Posts.json. And just like before, it takes standard JSON syntax, and we're going to say layout colon, and this was, I believe, layouts / post.html. So if I've done that right, we'll save that in, and we'll go to our first post. I should now be able to delete this layout from the front matter of my markdown file, save it in, and we go back over, refresh the page, go on into that post, and you can see we still have all of the template that we expect to get out of it. So very, very handy to keep us from repeating ourselves. There's also an idea in Eleventy of collections being done by tag, and so you could also specify in the same JSON file a tag as well, and label that posts. You could also, if you had like a big navigation and didn't want to do a lot of work around checking against like what nav items should be activated, you could actually give like a nav active thing, and you could put this variable in your template as well to make maybe a simpler way of identifying which nav item is active. There's a lot of different things that you can utilize this sort of directory based file out of. So that's the absolute basics of utilizing data in Eleventy. You specify a data file, a JSON file or a JavaScript file. And actually let's talk real fast about the simplest way of doing a JavaScript data file instead of a JSON data file. So here we have standard JSON. Instead, we're going to go ahead and actually let me move this down for a second. This is a node-based static site generator, so we can actually specify a module export for a JS file that's going to allow Eleventy to pick up the data that it returns. And so in this case, we're going to say module exports. It'll help if we change the file name, file extension to JS. There we go. Module exports equals. Let me make sure I get my syntax correct for y'all. And then we can actually have this create a return object as well. Let me go over to our documentation real fast and pull that up real fast. So yeah, you can return an array, you can return a function, you can return really anything that an export can return. So in this case, we'll just spit out an object, and this will be site name colon, this is our new .js site name, and then we will remove that from down here, save this in, get an error in our console, excellent news. That's right, it doesn't take quotes around the prop name, so we'll save that. I now have a cat on the desk, so we will see how that goes for y'all. Serve that file again, no errors in the console, and we come back over to our local host. This is our new .js site name. That's one thing I always forget, is that JSON wants strings for each of its property names, and a JavaScript module export, when you're doing an object in there, just wants a variable name instead. So I always, when I go back and forth between those, I get kind of confused myself. So you might say, this is all well and good, but what is the advantage of this over doing something similar in JSON instead? What this gives you is all the power of JavaScript, all the power of Node specifically, inside a data file, which can be very, very handy if you want to do any sort of transformations, if you want to go out and reach an API. So that's what we're going to do real fast. We're going to see, I'm going to attempt my luck, and we're going to work at putting an async function in our export that's going to go and fetch the latest Meetup events from Meetup.com, from a Meetup.com group. So I'm going to get my cheat sheet up so that I'm ready to go. And we want this open, and I want... Okay, so the first thing we want to do is I actually want to utilize an NPM module called Axios. It is a great way of just having a standard GET kind of a API request. It makes your requests a little bit more streamlined, and it's good syntax. So I'm going to, in console, we're going to npm install -- save, because again, at some point we might want to deploy this, so you want to have this in your package.json. And I'm going to get the Axios package from NPM, which I'll be curious. I think I actually may have already done this. Yeah, you can see in my package.json, we actually don't have to do the entire install. I have 2 additional packages from last week. We have the Eleventy package here, which is how we are running Eleventy right now. And then we also have Axios, and then there's another package called .env, because I highly recommend, if you're doing any sort of API keys, you use environment variables to do that, and this simply streamlines that process for us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to the root of our project. I'm going to create literally a .env file. So add file .env, and then I can go and I can put anything that I need to in here as environment variables. When you actually init git in here, don't have this go into your Git repository, because these will be sensitive pieces of information. Most static site generator or most static site hosts will give you some sort of way of putting your environment variables in the admin. There's more details on that in the blog post that I wrote, so that's down below. And so I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to specify 2 variables that I know I need. One is going to be our Meetup API key, and the standard syntax on these is going to be all caps and snake case. And then I also want a Meetup URL. This isn't necessarily a sensitive piece of information, but it is something that I can maybe want to change on the fly in my admin. And so I just went ahead and dumped it into my end file anyway. So it's the variable name equals some string. And so I know off the top of my head, because I have it up here in my other browser window, that the Meetup URL I want is this hyphenated name, and I'll show you where I get that from. So if we go to meetup.com, I'm part of the Memphis technology user groups. This is actually the next meetup that I personally am hosting, the Memphis Web Workers, which is next Tuesday at 9. But I'm going to go ahead and go to the Memphis technology users group, and then you can see in the URL, this is actually the unique identifier for the meetup group. So this is actually a unique identifier across the board. You go to meetup.com/this string, and that's what we're going to get. And we're actually going to also pull up the API documentation for Meetup. Should have gotten that up before Meetup API. There it is. And the handy thing about the Meetup API is that their documentation is okay, but they have an interactive console, which is good to go. You can click on whatever you need, and then you can also grab your API key here. I'm not going to share that, because obviously then you can make API requests against my API key, but it's really handy that you can just kind of toggle over. It's secure.meetup.com/meetup API. You can also get it from Google pretty easily. But we're going to go ahead and grab the URL that we need. So I want to get all of the events for that string. So Memphis technology user groups, right? You can specify the number that you want to return. There's pagination that you can do if you want, but in this case I'm just going to get 20 just so we can take a look at it. Click show response. So here's the request URL that we want. And so what that's going to do is it's going to be what I can give to Axios in our code. So let me go ahead, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second. Hopefully you can still hear me. I'm going to paste in my API key into our .env file. Just know that that's going to be there. Hopefully I won't mess up and show y'all again. Go ahead and close that. And that's the last we're going to see of our .env file, right? I got those 2 variables in there. Now they are accessible in our JavaScript. So I'm going to come in and head back to our data file, which is missing all of a sudden. That's interesting. Settings.js. Oh, I haven't actually created the one that I want. So we'll leave settings.js as it is here, and we're going to create a meetups.js file as well. Meetups.js. We're going to take a similar look, and we're going to say this is going to have a module exports. And this time we're going to specify an async function. It can just be an anonymous function. And then we're going to do a lot of our work inside there. So you can see I've already made a mistake. There we go. So we're going to require in a couple things to get this moving. First and foremost, we need to require in Axios so that we can use it in our project. So we'll let Axios equal require Axios, and that's just the NPM package. And then let me find, I'm also going to require in, and not actually set it as a variable, but I'm going to bring our .env configuration. This will allow for access of those variables. So I've got that saved in. You can see our terminal is doing some different stuff down here now. Let me close this one out. And you can see when we save a file, Eleventy is now running that script and giving us benchmark data around how long it takes, which is super helpful. Now, our meetups.js file is not doing anything yet, so there's nothing to do. So it's a 39 millisecond wait. Not, it's a lot of time for doing nothing. But inside of our function, we can then go in and start building out a way of fetching that data. And so first and foremost, I'm going to go ahead and create a string URL that we're going to use with our Axios get method that is a template literal of this request URL from Meetup. And I'm going to change out, you could hard code this and it would be a-okay, but if you ever want this to be reusable, it's helpful to go ahead and abstract it out as a template literal of process.env, which is the variable string that we need to get to our variables in our env file, and this is Meetup URL. And then we also need at the end of this to specify our key. So we're going to give it the variable that we need is sig, all lowercase, sig ID, and then we're going to do that same way of interpolation of our variable process.env, and in this case it's .meetup key. So this is going to be our URL that we're going to send a request to hopefully get information back from the Meetup API. So next we need to actually do something and send out a call into the ether of the internet to bring back that data. And so we're going to go ahead and put this in a return. You don't have to do this in a return. You could set this as a variable as well. It just makes sense that this is the data we're going to return, so let's go ahead and do it. And we're going to say Axios, which is our package, and they have a get method that accepts a parameter of a URL to run that get request off of. In this case, it is our string of URL up there. And then this is an async function. What Axios gives us is a promise-based way of doing this, which is helpful for Eleventy. It's going to keep our build process a little bit better. So I'm going to give it a then, which is going to be where we run our successful function. So function response is the response we're going to get back from the server, and we'll do all of our success inside of this then. And then we're going to have a catch statement down here, which is going to have a function with an error, and we'll handle the error in the simplest way, in this case with a console log of the error, because this is actually going to spit out the error into our console, which is super handy, as will our success. So our success, just so we can see what we're working with here, we're going to take that response and we're going to console log that so we can take a look and make sure we're getting things. Console log response, save that in. As you can see, we're already doing work down here, and the actual JSON object that we get back as the response is down here, which is super handy. You can see all 20 of the events that are coming up and the variables that are in there. So you can do a lot of things. If you needed to massage this data, you could do that. If you needed to do any number of filters on it, you could do that. But the only thing that we need to worry about is the fact that we're actually getting back the entire response object. So we've got the status and the headers and all that, and we just want the data for our template. So we can actually come in here and you can read through all this, or we can know that the response that we get has a data object on it, which is the data that we want. So if we come into our console again, it has spit all that back out at us, and it is now just the data object, which is what we're going to return out of our function. So return, in this case we want response.data. Delete the console log, save that in, if we play our cards right, we can go back to our base.html, and maybe after our posts, we can now loop through that data. So we can say for Meetup in this case, it's the same way as the settings, where it was settings.whatever. In this case, it is just Meetups, because that is the file name that this comes from. Put an N4 at the bottom. And now let's just take a look at the Meetup object for each of these. And this should spit out pretty ugly looking variable dump onto our page. It did not, unfortunately. So let's just take a look at meetup.name. Let's reload this. We always get into trouble when I'm trying to do the fancy stuff on stream. Okay. Still not. Oh, I'm on post. There we go. Let's go back home. So there are all those names, and if we want to just look at Meetup, it'll actually spit that JSON onto the page. It's pretty darn ugly, but you can find all the variables you need here. And so you could actually have maybe put a UL around this, UL, and then inside of that, each of these could be a list item, and then that list item could have an anchor, which links to meetup.url, and then the meetup name is inside of that anchor. So meetup.name, say that in, and there's a list of the next 20 meetups that are coming to the Memphis Technology Community Group, which is really handy. But let's say I want to only display the ones for my personal meetup group, which is the Memphis Web Workers. So that's this one right here, right? We also have a way of doing custom filters inside of Eleventy. So most static site generators have this idea. Ruby, Jekyll has it. You can write Ruby filters around it. I just happen to know JavaScript, so that's why I've kind of moved to Eleventy. So what we can do is we can specify in our configuration file. Let me get cheat sheet back up. Real important to always have your cheat sheet handy. And there's a method on the config object in your configuration settings that allows you to see how we've got config.addCollection. We can also run config.addFilter. And so I'm going to create a custom filter called lookup that's going to look to this file, which is going to create a little JavaScript snippet that's going to filter the array that we pass into it. So let's take a look at that real fast. Let's go ahead and create a new directory, because I like to keep things as clean as possible. New directory of filters, which is what we named it in our require statement there. And then inside that, we're going to create a lookup.js file. .js. And so just like the other stuff we've done, this is going to be a module export. So we're going to go ahead and export that out. Module exports equals, and this is going to be a function. And this function takes multiple arguments, the first of which is the data that's being passed in via the template. So that is just going to be an array. And then any number of additional things that we pass in via a string in that template filter. And so this is going to be, I'm going to name it filter string. And then we can do whatever we need to inside that. And what we need, so let's go ahead and just say we're going to return first the array just as it stands. We can actually go over to our base.html, and instead of looping through the meetups, what we're going to do is we're going to use the assign tag, which is a liquid tag, assign, and we're going to create a new variable name, meetup search, and we're going to, let's see, there we go. The syntax is going to be meetup search equals, and we're going to have that array again, so the meetups array that we already had, and then we're going to give it a pipe, which is how we tell Eleventy and Liquid that we're putting a filter here. And the filter we're going to have is the lookup filter, which we define that string in our Eleventy configuration. and then we're going to use a colon, and that's where we pass in that secondary string. So I know that my string is going to be web workers. I'm going to save that in, and now we're going to use this variable for our loop instead of the meetups. And right now, since all we're doing is returning the array, we should see no difference, which we do. But this is the syntax. You can no longer use this variable, the meetups variable, and put the filter in here. You're going to have to assign it out in a data block up here. So we're going to go back over to our lookup.js, and we're going to specify just a relatively simple JavaScript filter method. So we're going to say, take our array, and we're going to overwrite that array by looking through array and filtering based on this small function. So in this case, we're going to use an arrow function. Because again, since this is in Node and we don't have to worry about browser support, we get to use a lot of the cool new syntax, which is where I like to play the most with this new syntax. So we have an arrow function where we take it and we say, all right, basically we want to return true if it matches a Boolean that we're about to return. So we're going to say return. We're going to look at the item.name, which is a string in our data, and we want to see if it includes the filter string that we've got. And this does a search through the entire string and matches exactly. I believe it can take some regex. I hate regex, and so we're just doing a very simple search on this one. So I'm just going to pass this in with filter string, and then we end our function and we return the new overridden array, which is just going to be hopefully that one item. So I believe we're going to have to reserve Eleventy anytime we make a change like this. Eleventy-serve. Okay, we have an error, so that's fine. We'll figure out what that error is. In our template base, an end for was not found. Excellent. Okay, simple one. Let's go ahead and bring that down, and we'll look for all of our fours. Here's a for, end for. That's interesting. Okay, doesn't seem like the actual error. Let's find out what's going on here. Compiling layout base, line 16, end for not found. So on line 16, okay, this seems to me to not be the actual error. Seems to be masking our actual error. So let's see, let's go ahead and cancel out, serve it again. Okay, so let's just look at Meetup search as the entire object. We're still on 8081, we are. All right, so Meetup search is now returning nothing. So that's excellent news. That's where our issue is coming in. Meetups, lookup. So let's go ahead and in our lookup, we're going to go ahead and specify a console log, which should help us. And we'll take a look at console.log item.name. We'll see what that returns when it runs. Serve that out again. Text an array, filter string, array equals return array. Just console log that array. Get rid of this console log. It's entirely possible that I'm passing in too much or bad data. That's giving us issues. Go ahead and bring back our base. Let's do that loop again. For Meetup in Meetup search and for, and then we will just look at meetup.name just to keep things simple. And let's stop this one. Save that in. All right, yeah, it's certainly not liking that at all, is it? Tag N4 not found, line 15. So this should give us a different error since we're no longer passing in the right data. So let's look at in meetups. Oh, and of course it was. Okay, so that's what we have there. And we now want to try that assign again. Let's see. Home page. Stat slice. So we're going to assign. Just going to paste this in. Assign meetup slice as meetups, and let's just take this one step at a time. Okay, no change, that's excellent. And let's go ahead and run our filter on it again. Lookup takes a string of, let's just do Memphis, see what happens on that one. Okay, so it's not erroring, that's good. And let's go ahead and add some break tags so we can see our data a little bit easier here. Okay, and let's look at web. Oh, you know what we did? I put this in here, and you can see this little dot up here. The simple things will get you every time. Make sure to save your files when you're adding configuration items. That filter was a filter that did not exist, so Eleventy could do nothing with it. Always entertaining. So now, as you can see, what should have happened 5 minutes ago is now happening. In our base, we run meetup slice equals meetups, filter, and I have a cat laying on my shift key. Excellent, thank you, Nancy. Meetups, filter with the lookup web workers, or in this case, just web, and it just returns one piece of data. And to confirm that the original array exists and is still healthy and strong, meetup in meetups, we'll go ahead and specify out all meetups down here. So we'll say list item meetup.name, and save that in. So does anyone have any questions about what's going on here? This is really the last piece of example I was going to show today. So go ahead and put any questions you've got over in the chat box, and I'll answer them as I can. But yeah, so now we have the filtered array up here, which is just the Memphis Web Workers, which is the community group that I run, and then every other meetup in that list of 20 down below. Now you can see it still has the Web Workers meetup, so unfortunately it does duplicate that, and there's nothing in the filter that I wrote today that takes care of that. But you could very easily write an exclude that does the reverse on that lookup as well, which would be a possible use of doing that. So overall, let me get back in here. There we go. That is some of the basics and a little bit of, maybe we'll call it the intermediate Eleventy data functionality. You can use a JSON file, you can use a .js file to do all of that, and then on top of that, what you can do is you can, in that JS file, import functionality from any API. So if you've got Meetup API, you could have a Twitter API, you could have the Word. I think Danny mentioned in last week's, he asked a question about using Eleventy with the WordPress headless CMS. You could use that. You could use that. You could import your post data or whatever data you want from WordPress over into that using that API. So really having the data files themselves be the ability to fetch data off of any API is incredibly handy to have. You're not writing other pieces of functionality to go on top of it. You're just putting that directly in your data. All right. So unless there are additional questions, I'm going to go ahead and plug a couple things. First and foremost, I have a few conferences coming up. In about 2 weeks, I'm doing a workshop at Magnolia JS on CSS Grid. As you can see up there, I also have practicalcssgrid.com, which is my online version of that. The thing to remember on that, if you are not currently a customer of that, I'm going to be adding some new examples into that, as well as adding an entire section on how to support older browsers using CSS Grid. I am going to be raising the cost of it at that point. So if you don't have it already, I recommend that you go purchase it in the next month or so. That cost is probably going to double if I had to guess. I'm still kind of working out the details on that. But you will get it for free if you are already a customer on that. And then also later in the year in June, I'm going to be attending Revolution Conference in Virginia Beach, talking about the CSS future with CSS Grid there. And then I'll be doing that same practical grid workshop up at KCDC in Kansas City in the middle of July. So a lot of fun things happening, a lot of good stuff happening, as well as working through new examples on my blog, brianlrobinson.com, every week, as well as new videos here on my YouTube channel that you should definitely go hit the subscribe and alert button down below. And then if you're interested in CSS Grid's up there waiting for you to go visit that site and get what is going to be a discounted price on an even bigger course in the future. So it looks like there were no additional questions on Eleventy, so we're going to go ahead and sign off for this week. I'm contemplating next Wednesday doing a static site, another part on the static site, utilizing Netlify CMS. So you get it's actually a React-based CMS where you don't have to have a server, you don't have to set anything up. It all works through GitHub. It's all a headless CMS. It's really, really a handy way of implementing content management on a static site. So until next time, I'll see you around the internet. Be sure to check out the blog, like I said, subscribe down below, and we'll see you around. Thanks, y'all.